Morning, guys. How are you? I have America at war in World War II. I apologize in advance. This one might be a little bit long, but there's a lot to cover here. You don't specifically need to know many of the battles, but you do need to know the big concepts that are happening that's going to fundamentally change the United States forever, or at least in this case, up through the current year of 2021. So obviously, our entire foreign policy, our entire way of life changed on December 7th, 1941. In the early hours, Pearl Harbor time, around 6:10 a.m., the Japanese launched a surprise attack. The attack was not a complete surprise. The surprise was that they had sailed their fleet far enough to attack Pearl Harbor. They figured that the attack would take somewhere else in the Pacific. It only lasted a couple of hours, but in that time, the Japanese did major damage to Battleship Row, as you can see in that aerial picture, and to many of the planes in Pearl Harbor. One of the things that goes unnoticed is battleships will not be the most important ships of World War II. That will be aircraft carriers. The three aircraft carriers that were at Pearl Harbor on December 7th had left Pearl Harbor a day earlier, and thus were not sunk, and this is going to allow the United States to recover from Pearl Harbor a lot quicker than the Japanese expect. You can see the awe-inspiring memorial of the USS Arizona, which sank immediately when a bomb from a plane sunk it right in the harbor. It is still a tomb today for the men who died on the USS Arizona. Again, guys, our foreign policy fundamentally changed. We will not ever again be isolationist, at least through today. We immediately become interventionists, and this will fundamentally change from the George Washington inspired no alliances and neutrality. All right, so we're going to flip back over to the war in Europe first. There are two theaters of war. The United States does something that no other country has ever successfully done in World War II. We fight a two-front battle. We have an entire army in Europe, and we have another entire army fighting in Asia against the Japanese. We declared war on the Japanese on December 8th. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. Germany, even though they did not have to, acknowledge their allies, and they declared war on the United States on December 12th. We immediately began to ramp up operations. Winston Churchill had been waiting for the United States to get into the war. The first thing they had to do was they had to win the Battle of the Atlantic. Germany had used their submarines to devastating effect. Between the invention of the British called the radar and between the convoy system, which you see in that one picture down below, they drastically reduced the damage that the German submarines were able to do. And the United States were not only able to ship 10 million troops to Europe, but massive amounts of supplies, not only to the Western Front, but also to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. We got our trial by fire. It's called blooding for an army. Remember, the United States has never fought an actual massive foreign war. World War I was an expeditionary army, and this was called Operation Torch. This was the invasion of North Africa, in which we pushed the Germans out of North Africa and out of Egypt. This was the first strategy, which was to hit the soft underbelly of Europe. We eventually would attack Italy, but the slog up Italy was too difficult, and we had to focus on another landing. This led to perhaps one of the most famous days, not only in U.S. military history, but in military history of the world. One of the largest land or sea-based invasion in history. 5,000 ships, 100,000 men hit the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The Germans had no idea that the Allies had that many ships. This was expected to be an incredibly bloody affair. Omaha Beach, as you can see in the top picture up there, was by far the bloodiest, also portrayed in the movie Saving Private Ryan, if you ever get a chance to watch that. However, it wasn't as bloody as they expected. The United States was able to effect an amazing landing along with help from the British and the Canadians. They landed at 5 separate beaches and linked up. However, D-Day is not just June 6, 1944. It was actually the first month and a half of the war, as the Allies had to link inland before they could start pushing the Germans back towards Germany. Myself and a number of people from Sandburg were able to go 2 years ago for the 75th anniversary. It's a tremendously awe-inspiring event. If you ever get a chance, this is American territory in France. It was gifted to the United States. This is where the soldiers who died in that first month and a half are buried. I'm next to one of the highest ranking officers who died. He died about a month after. It was Teddy Roosevelt Jr., Teddy Roosevelt's son. And the gentleman in the bottom right corner is a guy who is friends with the guy from the movie Saving Private Ryan. And we were lucky enough to be out there when he was out there by himself, reposing a picture from that famous movie. And that picture up in the top right hand side, I actually took 2 years ago and I put it in black and white. There are hundreds of, actually thousands of reenactors that come every year, but there were many there that year because of the 75th anniversary. I also cannot resist. This is a video. We got to do an amazing thing. This is us storming the beach at Omaha Beach 75 years later. We found some Italians that had an old American duck, and they allowed us to ride along. And if you look as you're coming in, you can see the high bluffs that the soldiers would have had to face. Those bluffs would have been filled with German artillery and machine guns. It would have been devastating, and the bravery that those guys had to take to get up those beaches is just, it's awe-inspiring to actually see what they had to go through. All right. Once we had a foothold in Europe, it was nobody realized except for Germany. Most people realized that the war was over. However, the Germans had one last gasp in them in the winter of 1944. They launched a winter offensive that was devastating. This was known as the Battle of the Bulge. As you can see, they pushed back over 70 miles into the Allied lines, but the Allies were able to cut them off and basically surround them. The bravery of the 101st Airborne Division was critical in this battle. And ultimately, this basically was the last gasp for Germany. After this, it was just a matter of whether or not the Soviets or the United States was going to get to Berlin first. Eventually, it was allowed that the Soviets were going to get the honor of taking Berlin, and Germany was defeated. In the meantime, as Germany was collapsing, the horror of what had actually happened during the war was found out. And we found out why we were fighting against fascism. We started coming across in early 1945 the quote unquote labor camps, some of them labor camps, some of them death camps. All told, eventually it was found that 6 million Jews and 5 million others, almost 11 million people, were systematically murdered by the Nazi regime. This is a horror. The picture in color down below is a camp from a couple years ago that I visited. I've been to 2 of these camps. I will tell you right now, everyone should visit at least one. It is a inspiring event, and it is also a devastating event. And there's just a feel when you are there. The systematic industrialized murder that the Nazis perpetrated on 11 million people is something that should never be forgotten. And unfortunately, the world has not learned this lesson, as there have been numerous massacres since 1945. And this is a lesson that we, unfortunately, as a world civilization, have still not learned. We shift to the war in the Pacific. This ramped up right after December 7th, 1941. Again, the United States is fighting an entirely separate war against Japan, for the most part on their own in the Pacific. We were able to recover, as I said, because of aircraft carriers. The key battle of Midway, which was recently made into a movie and is a tremendous movie if you get a chance to see it. But the key to the Pacific that you need to know is our strategy was island hopping. Okay. And island hopping was basically taking certain fortified islands that the Japanese had in the Pacific and taking those key islands while skipping other islands where they had troops located, but not enough troops to stop the stretch from the United States all the way to Tokyo. Some of the key islands were Iwo Jima. The bloodiest battle, however, was the Battle of Okinawa. But once the Battle of Okinawa was over, we could base our bombers and we could start bombing mainland Japan. The top picture above was actually even more devastating than what I'm going to show you in a minute. That was the firebombing of Tokyo. Much of Tokyo was wooden, and we used incendiary bombs. Over 100,000 people died in the firebombing of Tokyo. This is one of the devastating facts of World War II, is that civilians for the first time were part of this, along with the Holocaust. Almost as many civilians died in World War II as did military personnel. And then finally, obviously, a major event in world history is the ending of the war in the Pacific. On August 6th at 6:07 local time, the world was plunged into the atomic age. This is incredibly important. Human beings have been writing down history for over 10,000 years. We have only been able to destroy ourselves as a planet for the past 70. We drop a bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th. 3 days later, on August 9th, we drop a second bomb on Nagasaki. These bombs were known as Little Boy and Fat Man. And this finally encouraged the Japanese to surrender. As you can see in this picture from 1945, the bomb exploded directly over this building here, which is why this building survived, but you can pretty much see what happened to the rest of the city. Remember, this is a single bomb that killed 75,000 people. This is the building today when we were there. They've turned the building and the surrounding park into something called the Peace Memorial Park, and it's an effort to get the world to denuclearize in the future. Again, even though the Cold War is over, these bombs still exist, and the potential to wipe out the entire human race still exists today. Finally, two conferences that you absolutely have to know and will completely shape the post-war world. In February of 1945, Roosevelt and Churchill traveled all the way to the southern Crimea in Russia to meet with Stalin, who refused to be pulled away from the war, as the war was still raging in Russia at that point. You can see that Roosevelt does not look well in this picture. He would be dead 2 months later. But at this conference, they discussed the future of Eastern Europe. This will never be solved. Their biggest issue was that the country of Poland would have fair and free elections. That would not happen ultimately in the future, and we'll talk about that in the future. 5 months later, the Big Three, as they were referred to, met again in southern Germany at a place called Potsdam. As you can see, two of the main characters are gone. Roosevelt at this point had died, and Harry Truman had taken over as president of the United States. And Winston Churchill was summarily elected out of office, even though he helped Britain through the war, and Clement Attlee took his place. Churchill did attend Potsdam, but was not one of the key players at Potsdam, since Clement Attlee was now the prime minister. Joseph Stalin basically had the advantage at this point. However, it was at Potsdam that Truman hinted at the fact that the United States had a new powerful weapon, which, as we will find out, Stalin already knew about, because Soviet spies knew that the United States was working on an atomic weapon, and it would take another 4 years before they would develop their own. This Potsdam is often looked at as one of the events that basically led to the Cold War, which is going to exist after World War II. And then finally, this is a key comparison here, guys. Remember, after World War I, Woodrow Wilson came up with the idea for the League of Nations. Even though it was an American idea, the United States decided not to join. The Senate refused to ratify the treaty. In this case, the United States was the leader in asking for an organization called the United Nations. They volunteered New York to be the place where it was built. They quickly encouraged all the other countries of the world to join. The United Nations is still the major peacekeeping organization in the world today, and their job is try to limit anything to the destructive level of World War II from ever happening again. And it is a key organization, not just in war, but also the World Health Organization, which is dealing with the pandemic right now. Those of you that are in Model United Nations, you could probably let your classmates know all the things that the United Nations does in the world today. All right. So that in a nutshell is Americans' participation. Remember that America will be fundamentally changed forever in post World War II. We have become the most prosperous and the most powerful country in the world by 1945. And even though the Soviet Union will challenge us on that score for the next 45 years during the Cold War, the United States will still be in a prime position that we are still in today as one of the leaders of democracy and peace in the world. All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.